Welcome back to the shop, my friends. Steve here at SKS Props, and in today's build video, we have a character from one of my all-time favorite horror video games, Pyramid Head from Silent Hill 2. Now, those that kind of know the story or know the lore, they absolutely butchered this character by putting him in the movie. The video game adaptation of him is so much more terrifying. If you have not played Silent Hill 2, I highly recommend it, and they just came out with a remake that looks absolutely fantastic. Now, this helmet is going to be a two-part video series. Part 1 is going to go all over the fabrication. Part 2 is going to be about paint. And that's because I wanted people to have an opportunity to put this all together before we go over an extensive paint job. And just like all the rest of my builds, this is made completely out of my HD foam, which you can find over at Blick Art Materials. And because of that, the entire helmet only weighs 2 pounds. So it's extremely lightweight. And that's fantastic for cosplay because it's not weighing on you. And yes, I can see out of this, and I will cover that in the video as well. So I want to show you what it takes to put this helmet together. Let's go ahead and get started. A couple of things to note: this is a very large build, and it is game accurate to scale, which means it's approximately 36 inches to the lowest part of the brim to the top of the point, and about 20 inches from side to side. So if you need to scale this at all for you, use that as your reference. Also, you will need 2 sheets of 10mm foam, as well as some 4mm foam, some foam clay, a 15mm round dowel, and a textured acrylic medium, which I do have links for all of these down in the description. Using the provided templates, we're going to start with part A, and this is going to be traced and cut out of some 10mm foam. And the important thing to note is that the sides of these pieces need to be cut at angles so they all fit together properly. Now, the angles and the seams don't have to be perfect because we are going to cover them up with 4mm strips later on. The 2 largest sides of the helmet are going to be made up of part B. This is also going to be traced and cut out of some 10mm foam. Now be sure to note the angles and flip this template for the opposite side. Wearing my respirator, I can now heat seal the foam before gluing it together. To adhere all these pieces together, I'm going to be using some weldwood contact cement. 2 thin layers are applied to each cut and left to dry. After the 2 halves have dried enough to become tacky, they can then firmly be pressed together. This process of gluing it together can then be repeated for the opposite side of the helmet. Next up, we have part C, which is also going to be traced and cut out of some 10mm foam. And again, I'm cutting the sides at angles so they create the correct shape. Just like the front pieces, more contact cement can now be applied to the edges. And I found it easiest to attach by pressing the edge together while it's flat and then folding it up. And if you're impatient, you can always use a hairdryer to help speed up the dry time of the contact cement. And with 5 pieces attached, our helmet is starting to take shape. The very back of the helmet is going to be made up of part D. Just like all the other pieces, these are going to be traced and cut out of 10mm foam. The process is repeated for heat sealing the foam, applying contact cement, and pressing the sides together. Now for the very back seam, if you need to sand this a little bit more or trim it away, feel free to do that. And as you can see here, my seams all the way around are pretty good. But again, it doesn't really matter if yours are off because we're going to be covering these with strips later on. Part E is going to make up the lower brim of the helmet, and this is also going to be traced and cut out of some 10mm foam. The ends of part E are going to need to be cut at an angle for the other sections to fit together. I also take this time to mark approximately a ½ inch all the way around the opening. This is a reference to line up the top of the helmet to the brim. The inside angle of part A needs to be a little bit steeper than I had originally cut, so I sand the foam down with my rotary tool to get the correct shape. Because I want a quicker bond, I switched over to using super glue here, but you could continue to use contact cement on your build. After the front is attached, then the sides can be glued to the bottom of part B, and having that angle to the bottom of part B will allow these sides here to flare down just a little bit. Part F can now be traced and cut out of some 10mm foam. The sides for this are going to be cut at 90-degree angles. These are going to line up with the angle cuts that I put at the end of Part E. Part G is going to make up the very back of the lower brim. This is also traced and cut out of some 10mm foam, making sure to flip this for both sides. For assembly, what I decided to do was glue the two Part G pieces together, and then once I had them secured, I could attach them to either side of Part F. And now the back of the helmet could be glued down to the brim. The helmet has two additional sections on the bottom, and these are going to be made up of Part H. To create a small gap, I'm going to glue down a strip of 4mm foam to act as a spacer. And before these are attached, I decide to go ahead and sand my edges. Glue is going to be applied to the spacer and to the front of Part H. Notice the line for the overhang that I have marked on the template. This is going to help you line up this piece correctly from the front to the back. I could then use additional superglue on the very end of Part H. I need a bunch of 1-inch strips, and these are going to be cut out of some 4mm foam. At each seam, I mark ½ an inch on either side. This will give me a reference guide to help line up my strips. Superglue can then be applied to 1/2 of the strip, and I work from the bottom up. When I get to the top, I figure out my angle and I cut away the excess foam so the two strips can fit together. After half of the strip had been adhered down to Part A, I could then wrap it around the side and glue it to Part B. I repeat the process of marking approximately ½ an inch on either side of the seam and then gluing my 4mm strips down. Now when you get to the very top, all these strips coming together do not need to look perfect. I'm actually going to be cutting some of this away and then filling it with foam clay and texture paste later on. The 1-inch strips at the bottom of Part B do need to be cut at angles to match the angle of the lower brim. Otherwise, there'd just be a small gap if it was cut straight. After the foam had been cut and marked, these strips could be glued into place. One-inch strips are also going to be glued to the bottom of Part C. Part I will need to be cut out of some 4mm foam 2 times. These will make up detail strips near the top of the helmet and will be glued to either side of Part B. Now there's a ring embedded into the helmet, and to replicate this I'm going to be using some 15mm HD foam round dowel. A Forstner bit is going to be used to drill through the foam, and then I can use some superglue to glue and insert one end of the dowel. Cutting away any excess foam, the other end can now be glued into place. He also has some kind of a pipe detail near the bottom that I'm going to make using a wooden dowel. The research I did on this was that it was supposed to be part of a cinematic that eventually got cut from the game. Scraps of additional foam can be glued around the base of this dowel to help build it up. To make the point at the top of the helmet, I'm first going to glue 3 pieces of 10mm foam together. Part J can then be traced and cut from this stacked foam to get the point. And to get the angle that I need, I'm going to trim away some of this foam at the top with a utility knife. The point can then be glued into place and additional foam removed. Now the helmet needs to be rusty and grimy, and to get some texture I'm going to be using some acrylic medium. Now there's lots of different brands that have these mediums out there, but for this build I'm going to be using the Utrecht brand Pumice Stone. This material is applied with a palette knife directly to the foam, and it's going to be built up in several layers so I get a good diversity of texture. And I will say it sticks to my HD foam great, and once it dries it will be both flexible and durable. While I let the first layer of the medium dry, I'm going to use some foam clay to create a smooth transition from the helmet to the point. This is why it didn't matter if all these strips didn't line up just right. Foam clay is also going to be applied around the small port at the base of the helmet. The helmet does have some additional textures on one side, and to simulate this I'm going to use more foam clay. Water is applied to the surface to help the foam clay stick, and then I can use my fingers and additional sculpting tools to press the material to the desired shape. I did add a second pass of acrylic medium in some spots to build it up, and here's what the textures look like after they were dry. Now I do need to be able to see out of this, so I'm going to be burning some small holes using a heat tool all the way through to the interior. These holes, along with several others that I'll put on the exterior, will blend into the surface once it's painted. And this is the great thing about building something that doesn't have to look perfect. You can modify the build or the textures to get the exact look that you need. And that's the fun and challenging thing about being a maker, is that sometimes these games have challenges and limitations that we have to overcome to make it in the real world. And with my holes burned, here's a demonstration that you can in fact see through. Now let's say you had glasses or your eyesight just wasn't that great. Other options that you could consider, you could also install a camera or make a bracket to hold your phone, that way you'd have a larger screen. So you all can see what it takes to put Pyramid Head's helmet together from Silent Hill 2. And this is a very personal build for me. This is a character that I have wanted to do for a while, but I wanted to do it right. And I think, so far anyway, this is a very good start. I think adding paint will just make it look that much better. And if you would like to make your own, I of course have free PDF templates available over on my website that you could download to build right along with me. And if you are building any of my builds or utilizing HD foam, be sure to tag me at SKSProps on Twitter and Instagram, because I love seeing your creations. Until next time, build your best with the best. HD foam.